Welcome again to our discussion about the Old Testament. We're going to be flying quickly through the worlds of ancient Israelite covenant law and ritual over the next few minutes. So there was a lot that I can't say in the time that we have, but I'll try to introduce you to some of these big topics. And I think these are really actually very important, interesting topics. Oftentimes by Christians, these are considered to be boring things, the books of Leviticus and Numbers and so on, and even the second half of Exodus no one seems to care about. However, I do think that these are not only crucial to our understanding of our own Christian faith and the history of our traditions and so on, but I think they're theologically very rich. So I'll try to explain that over the next 20 minutes or so. All right, so one of the things that we talk about when we talk about the Old Testament is the law. It's sometimes used as a shorthand for the entire Old Testament tradition. This is, of course, Paul uses it in this sense. I'll let your New Testament class sort that out a bit, what Paul exactly means by the law. But I should say that law in the ancient Near East would not have encompassed many of the things that you find in the Pentateuch, that is the first 5 books of the Bible. That is, law codes in the ancient Near East, just like law codes today, did not include histories of the entire cosmos. They didn't include creation stories. They didn't include genealogies. Law codes of the ancient Near East, they looked somewhat like law codes of today. There are some major differences, of course, but one of the things that looks similar is that they have finite laws. I mean, so if someone does something bad, then this is going to be the punishment for it. The law, when we talk about the Old Testament as the law, I think we miss a couple of things. The first thing that's important to point out is that that word in Hebrew that's used, that's translated as law, that's Torah. It doesn't actually mean law. There's lots of words in ancient Semitic languages that actually mean things like laws, like law codes, that is, statutes that get enforced. The word chok is one of them in Hebrew. But that's not what Torah means. Torah actually just means instruction. It means to teach something, to point at something. Torah, or what we call the law, was not ever really understood as entirely 5 books of law themselves. So how does law work in the ancient Near East, actually? Well, what we have materially are a bunch of these law codes, and in fact there are law codes that we have that are 1,000 years older than Hammurabi's code. A lot of people think Hammurabi's code is the oldest law code in the world, but it's not. But it's the oldest complete law code that seems to have been copied a lot and passed around a lot. But Hammurabi himself and his law code borrowed from these much more ancient Eastern law codes that existed before him. One of the things that we can see just by looking at these law codes, and if you want to peruse the Code of Hammurabi, which is posted on the course website, you can see this. They are not comprehensive. They're not designed at all to cover all aspects of life. The law code of Hammurabi doesn't really have much in the way of legislating what happens if someone just intentionally murders someone else. If you start reading the law code of Hammurabi, you'll get some. I mean, there's some pretty crazy stuff that pops up in what seems to us unusual orders. That is, that it's not organized in ways that seem effective to us, at least to many folks from a Western background. So what are these law codes then? Well, there's actually a big controversy within ancient Eastern studies about what exactly they are and what they do. But let me just explain Hammurabi's code for a minute as an example of this. You can see this is the stela of Hammurabi's code. A stela is like a big statue, a big carved piece of rock, and on top there's an image, and then all the rest of it in tiny print that you can't even see from here is the actual law code itself, written in cuneiform, the script of the Akkadian language, the language of Mesopotamia. And this is at the Louvre today, but it was captured when Babylon fell and it was taken to Persia, from which point it was taken to France after via colonialism. So in any event, but you can see the very top of this image, and I'll come closer to show you this. This image is trying to explain to you how ancient Eastern law works. This is like not everyone could read. Most people couldn't read in the ancient world, but some people could. But everyone could see, and people who could see this publicly placed statue with the inscription of the law code on it could see this image, and they can understand what it meant. So on the left you see Hammurabi. He's got a shepherd's hat on, what looks like a little knit cap, and this was a typical hat for ancient Near Eastern kings. it would show that they were the shepherd of the people. Hammurabi is holding his hand up in a gesture of greeting and kind of humble greeting to a seated character. The seated figure on the right is Shamash, the sun god. I know that because he's got what look to be kind of stinky armpits, those kind of lines moving up from his armpits. Those are actually, that's light emanating from his body. He's the sun god. He's got what looks to be a soft serve ice cream hat on. Those are actually horns. Many horned headdress is a sign of deity or God stature in the ancient world. So this is a seated god on his throne, and he's holding out what looks to be a stick and a circle to Hammurabi. That's a staff, a measuring staff, a reed like a cannon, measuring staff, and also a cord. Those are both measuring tools. And what Hammurabi's giving, what Shamash, the sun god of Mesopotamia, is giving to Hammurabi the king, is the authority to make the law. So the law wasn't given to the kings by gods. The gods gave the king the responsibility to set up the world so that it would function correctly, so that the kings the kings would organize society and keep the peace, so that the farmers would farm, so that the kings could then give the food to the gods, and the gods could be at peace. Remember, in the ancient Near East, the entire reason for worshiping gods is to keep the world in order so that the gods can be happy and not have to work. So this is a big part of ancient Eastern culture. So the law codes are created by the king in order to try to keep order, but really the law codes themselves are not applied. We've got a lot of actual decisions from judges that have been written down in the ancient Near East on more disposable materials than rock like this. So just on little potsherds and stuff, we've got little records of court cases and what happened, and no one ever cites Hammurabi's law code. What the judges are probably formed by the ideas or the principles inside Hammurabi's code. That is, the reason you make a law code is to try to tell people some of the principles of justice, but you don't expect them necessarily to actually literally apply any of these laws precisely to other cases. So it's an instruction in wisdom, really, for the judges. So in any event, this is the idea of ancient law codes and why people have them. Now, in the ancient world, but the thing I've been calling law codes this whole time, that's criminal law. Just like in the United States, we have criminal law, right? Or civil law, we would put in the same category, right? I mean, the legal authorities. Now, the stuff we find in the Bible is actually all mixed up. We have some of this criminal law code stuff in the book of Exodus and in the book of Deuteronomy, say, like what happens if you have an ox and it gores people and hurts them, and you don't fix the problem, and you know there's a problem, and it gores some more people, well, then you're criminally liable. That stuff is in the Bible, but that stuff has its own category of literature in the ancient world, like Hammurabi's code. But what you don't find in Hammurabi's code is anything about be nice to your neighbor, be a good person, treat your parents with respect. That kind of stuff is reserved for family instruction in the ancient Near East, which was not a part of the criminal law code. In the same way that in the United States, there's no law about being nice. That would be ridiculous, right? To think that the state of Georgia, let's say, is going to tell me that I need to be nice to people. That's something that we leave up to families or maybe schools, other categories of social and cultural life that try to inculcate a sort of civic duty of responsibility to one another. And then those are completely separate in the ancient world from religious regulations. That is, there wasn't a criminal law code that said you had to worship on a certain day of the week, or that you had to do sacrifices a certain way, or that you had to worship any particular god in the ancient world. They assumed that lots of different peoples worshiped lots of different gods all over the place, and they assumed that the king wasn't necessarily responsible for the way that you did your sacrifices. That was up to the priests. The high priests, that was their job. If he came to the king and said, "King, this person is sacrificing this animal improperly," the king would say, "Go talk to the priests about it. I'm busy. I have criminal, civil, foreign policy things to worry about." In the same way that if you went to the king and said, my neighbor's not being nice to me, my neighbor's rude, the king might say, "Go talk to the neighbor's, mother or father or clan leader. Go talk to some family person, or just deal with it." In the same way, if you go to the high priests and you would say, "My neighbor's not being nice to me," the high priest would say, "Morality is the job of your family." We have books of temple regulations from the ancient Near East, and they never mention anything about being nice to other people. They never mention anything about criminal law either, because it's not their jurisdiction. It's not their world. So what priests run in the ancient world is how temples work, and how sacrifices work, which days are holy and not. And every once in a while, the religious regulations will tell a king what to do. The king has to show up and the king has to do a sacrifice a certain way or something like this. But the priest regulations don't ever, that is the law codes of the priests, the priestly codes of the ancient Near East, don't ever tell the king what to do. In the same way that they don't tell families what to do about teaching ethics to their children. So the world of ethics or family instruction, the world of criminal law and the kings, and the world of religious regulations and the high priests, those tended to be pretty separate in the ancient world, unless you got down to the kind of a rural community in which these things would all get mixed together. That is because the clan leaders were the criminal and civil law. They had jurisdiction over everyone in that area, but also they would be the local priests. That's what we find in Israel, except it's an entire nation that seems to have mixed some of this stuff together. That is, when we read the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, we're reading a document that mixes together criminal law, family instruction, religious regulations, all kinds of things, and genealogies, family stories, and it mixes in some creation myths, as we've talked about with Genesis 1 and 2 and 3. It mixes in short stories about matriarchs and patriarchs, or the ancestors. All of these things get kind of mushed together into a big hodgepodge, and this is the only document like this that at least I've been able to find in the ancient Near East. As ancient Near Easterners have creation stories, they have family instruction, they have criminal law, they have religious law, but they don't have it all mishmashed together. That seems to be a unique feature of ancient Israel. That is, they smushed all these different literatures into one. Now, I think there's a lot of things you can say about this. Christine Hayes, who teaches at Yale, I've posted some of her lectures online because I find her to be brilliant and a very important thinker in terms of biblical studies. And she says that this is making a claim. And I think she's right. That claim is that God, the God of Israel, has authority over all aspects of your life. And this is a very unusual claim in the ancient Near East. So Israelite law is a mishmash of all this other stuff, and what's amazing to me is that it all gets, that is, the first 5 books of the Bible get categorized as something that is a covenant. Genesis isn't necessarily part of the covenant, although there's covenants all in Genesis. That is, Genesis 9 has a covenant with Noah, there's 2 covenants with Abram, and so on. But there's also the covenant at Sinai, and all of the first 5 books of the Bible end up getting kind of encompassed in this story of the covenant. This might surprise you, but in the ancient Near East, covenant is not a particularly theological word. In Hebrew, it's berit. It's a cognate term in many Semitic languages. It just means an agreement or a deal, and almost exclusively is non-theological. So that is, there is, if I was to buy a house, I would make a covenant with someone. It would be a deal. I'll pay you a certain amount of money, and you give me the house, right? Or vice versa. And if I wanted to make a deal with you, let's say that I don't want you to not cross this boundary, and you agree, and you say, okay, fine, you don't cross that boundary. This is what we see with Laban and Jacob in Genesis 31. They make a covenant, an agreement. In the ancient world, we don't see gods making covenants with people. It's just an unusual thing that ancient Israel does. And what's maybe more amazing is that you especially wouldn't have a god even talking to a people in the ancient Near East. The high gods, they don't have time to talk to any random person, let alone all the people at once. The high gods talk to high individuals, kings and priests. The only time that I've ever been able to find, and there are other scholars who've tried and who've come up with the same answer, the only time that I've been able to find a god speaking to a people in the ancient Near East is Israel, and is in the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy, where God addresses a community. And there's one great biblical scholar, Dean McBride, who taught at Union Theological Seminary for many years. He said that Deuteronomy is it's the creation of a people, the creation of a polity. It is God is constituting a community as a political entity, and this is highly unusual because that's just not how ancient Near Easterners ever thought about political constituencies, political units. I mean, the king dominated a certain area, a certain territory. Certain people were within that territory. They were beholden to the king. This is the way that ancient polity works. God addressing a people and creating a polity out of thin air by means of an agreement, a covenant, a deal, is just unheard of. And so you can probably guess at some of the theological explosions that I can see happening in the ancient world by means of ancient Israel's claim that they have made an agreement with their God, and their agreement wasn't with an individual, it was with the whole people. So in Exodus chapter 20, you see that all the people are addressed, and all the people say, yes, we will do these things. Of course, Moses acts as a go-between, but he's not a king. He's not a hierarchical authority in the sense that he was born to power or seized it. He is a humble servant of Yahweh, and he dies before claiming any land of his own. He's not a king. So in any event, I think this is a radical, a political and theological act. I think it's the foundation of the Western, at least modern, conception of democracy. I mean, I think there were somewhat democratic societies before this, especially clan-based, more local political structures. There's arguments about ancient Mesopotamia. We can see some of the traces of some of these earlier, more democratic polities. But by the time the ancient Israel emerged, right around the year 1000 BC, these were few and far between. And ancient Israel tried, at least for a while, to create a massive polity that covered quite a bit of territory and had lots of different internal variations of tribes and clans and so on that were connected in something like a confederacy that claimed that they had made a contractual relationship with a particular god, that is Yahweh. Anyway, I find this to be amazing and has all sorts of richness that can be preached and taught and so on. So I think introducing people to the kind of the magic, really, of this ancient covenant is, I think, a huge part of our task today. So, there's some, I'm just kind of popping some images in there. There's a picture from a medieval Haggadah, a Passover text manual that has an image of Moses holding the two tablets of the law with all the people around. And I'm kind of cramming three images there, right? That civil criminal law, an image of Hammurabi's code, the image of the ritual law of the priests, and the image of the kind of family wisdom or ethics that is all kind of crammed in there in Moses' law by means of the covenant. So there were lots of different kinds of covenants in the ancient world. Two main ones that I'll point out is the parity covenant. That's where two kings make a deal with one another. This is what you're seeing right here. This image is of the oldest parity covenant or peer kind of covenant in the world, when at least that anyone's been able to find. It's the first peace treaty in the history of the world, where two kings, the king of the Hittites and the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, made an agreement near the end of the Bronze Age that they were going to seek peace, that they were going to stop fighting one another. And no one surrendered to the other. There was just an agreement, we're going to stop fighting. And this is what we might call a parity covenant. When the kings make this, they tend to call each other brothers, even though they aren't literally brothers, but they use that as a term for people who are related now that a covenant has created a relationship between them. Here's another one of these public covenants. This is also between the Hittites and Egypt, and it had chains here. This was meant to be hung in a public space so people could see it and read it and hear it read aloud and remind themselves that they aren't supposed to attack this other country and so on. I'm showing you this because obviously this is something to do with the public nature of the law of Israel, which is supposed to be read aloud so that the people hear and know and remember. You can probably hear some of the resonances with Deuteronomy. Well, there's another kind of covenant in the ancient world, and that's the suzerainty covenant. That's where one of the parties is higher than the other, more powerful, is recognized as an authority over the other. This word suzerain is taken from medieval vassal relationships, feudalism, the political arrangement of medieval Europe, but it does apply to the ancient Near East, not exactly, but roughly. So we use the term. But a suzerain is like a lord, and the vassal is the lower king or lower person who is agreeing. It makes one of these covenants, these agreements, and these tend to have a particular pattern in the ancient Near East, and that pattern is the pattern after which the Torah is is patterned, especially Exodus and Deuteronomy. These are set up like covenants, but like these suzerainty covenants in particular. And we have other suzerainty covenants. We can read them and we can see, gosh, these look a lot like Exodus and Deuteronomy, except they're between two kings of the ancient world. So Coogan talks a bit about this, and there's some other examples in the Christopher Hayes book. If you are interested in this, the book Hidden Riches, that goes into some detail with these. This image that I'm showing you here is of the black obelisk of Shalmaneser. This is the first picture of an ancient Israelite that I know of, the guy bowing down and kissing the ground. That's the king of the northern kingdom, Jehu, who started a new dynasty in the 8th century. And you can see Jehu is bowing down and kissing the feet of the ground in front of the Assyrian king Shalmaneser, the guy who looks like he's holding up a cup. Shalmaneser has a little winged sun disk over to the side of him. That's a figure of divine protection and empowerment. So this is a picture that on this big obelisk, and Jehu is shown here as propaganda. He did, in fact, Jehu, the king of the northern kingdom of Israel, did sign one of these agreements with the king of Assyria, who was much more powerful than him, and he gave him lots of stuff. You can see some of that stuff in the image underneath, the kind of band of images underneath where Jehu is kissing. There's a little camel you can see. He gave lots of what looked to be exotic animals to the king Shalmaneser as a way of giving tribute. But anyway, the suzerainty treaty formula was one that would have been very familiar to ancient Israel. They signed lots of these suzerainty covenants and recognized foreign kings as their masters. But there's a specific claim being made when this is used as a template for their relationship to God. That is, God is your suzerain. God is taking the place of these foreign kings as the one who you are supposed to give all of your, recognize who has all of the authority, who you're supposed to give things to, the one who you're supposed to look to for guidance but also protection. I'll skip that, just in terms of time. That's just more ancient treaties. But here we have an image that is showing us the 3 different main codes, law codes, in the Old Testament. We can see these kind of roughly are in order of age as well. We imagine that the covenant code actually has some of the older elements, some of the oldest elements in the Bible in it. There's a couple of laws that seem to have been actually quoted from Hammurabi's code or borrowed from a similar tradition, whatever Hammurabi's code borrowed from, but laws that were thousands of years old that were being used as exemplars of wisdom. So Exodus 20 through 23, framed by chapter 19 of Exodus, where they reach the mountain, and also capped with chapter 24 of Exodus, where there's a meal, a sacred meal that's held to ratify this covenant. You know, when you make a deal, sometimes you have a meal with the person who you made a deal with in order to kind of seal it. This covenant code in between is, as I said, an amalgam of different kinds of laws, laws having to do with rituals, laws having to do with business transactions, laws having to do with family strife, and so on. And then the second law code, we call it the holiness code. Now you could say all of Leviticus is in a way a code. I would say that Leviticus chapters 1 through 16 are a priestly manual, not really a law code. They're a manual that tells priests how to act, how to carry out ritual duties. The second half of Leviticus, starting with chapter 17 and going through 26, that really does look more like a law code. It's written for all people, not just for priests. And it seems to be trying to help the people understand that they are holy too. That is, that some of these ritual activities are their responsibility, not just the priests. Again, there's this democratization that happens here. That's not something that you see in other ancient Eastern cultures. That is, the priests don't say, by the way, it's everyone's job to make sure we're holy. Now, we'll get more to holiness in just a little bit, but I just want to point out it's a unique feature of ancient Israelite religion. And then third, you can see that there's the Deuteronomic code. Sorry, I still, biblical scholar, and I can't quite say that word right. Deuteronomic. Deuteronomy obviously is one of the books of the Pentateuch, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. It's called Deuteronomy because of the Greek, which was used to name it when it was translated into Greek. The early Christians and the early Jews who translated it calls it Deuteronomy. That is the second telling of the law. It's a retelling of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers in a way. If you flip through it, the middle of the law code, as we've asked you to do, you'll be able to see that some of these laws replicate the laws in Exodus 20 to 23. Some of them are actually quite new and different. So this retelling of the law is actually an updating of the law for, we think at least, biblical scholars think, is a new day. We think this this retelling is set in terms of the narrative before they get to the Promised Land, but we think it's actually telling us about a little bit further in time, later in time, a time maybe more in line with the early monarchy through to the time of Hezekiah and Josiah, where there are some reforms that seem to be sparked by some of the theology in Deuteronomy. So in any event, these three different law codes have three different characters or flavors to them, and we think they actually come from three different communities. They don't all quite agree. That is, that they have these areas of mutual overlap, and then they have these areas where they don't actually address some of the same issues. And they seem to all have their own theological lens. But somebody in the history of ancient Israel thought that it was important to blend all of these, or preserve all of these ancient law codes and meld them together instead of saying one of them is right and all the rest are wrong. I've got lots of reasons for why I think that, but maybe we can address that in the comments. So, Israel's law, we can say is, we can use that term to mean, if we mean Torah, to mean Israel's teaching, all the teaching that there is about God. That's basically the whole Bible and more. They had a lot more stuff to say about God that made it into the Bible. But we can also say that Israel's law, if we want to take it in a technical sense, would be those law codes, Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy. There is some law mixed in Numbers as well, but a lot of that is actually ritual instruction and things like that too. Here, this is an image of Rembrandt, a famous image of Moses about to smash the tablets of the law when he got really mad when he saw the Israelites worshiping a golden calf. One of the things I want to point out about the law, Christine Hayes in her lecture has a lot more about this, and I'll be very brief. But one of the things that strikes me about the law, well, there's a bunch of things. One aspect I should point out is that it is an ancient Near Eastern law. As Israel's got some things that are unique about them. I've already pointed some of those out. The democratic tendencies and so on. The anti-monarchical, that is anti-king bias. But there are some parts that are thoroughly ancient Near Eastern and even share some of the flaws, I would say, in our contemporary society. And just to point those out and be clear about them, ancient Israelite society, like many contemporary societies, was patriarchal. That is, it thought that men mattered more than women in general, and it valued men's lives more, it valued men more monetarily, and there are laws that tend to treat women as property of a man, and sometimes don't take very seriously women's roles as agents, independent agents, that is, as full people. I should point out too that there's slavery in these law codes. It's just assumed. Every ancient Eastern society that I've seen record of has slavery of some kind or another. This doesn't seem to be chattel slavery in the same way that was practiced in the United States, let's say in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. It's a slightly different version of slavery, but in slavery nonetheless. People were owned either temporarily as debt slaves, where they work off their debt, or some people were owned in perpetuity. Those tend to be folks who were captured in war as foreigners, would be taken as slaves in perpetuity. So this is just a part of the Bible. It accepts that this exists in the same way that a patriarchal culture is just assumed to be the norm in the Old Testament. Now, that's not the end of the story, though. I do think that there are some glimmers of hope, if that is a non-patriarchal society is something that you hope for, and I hope that is something that you hope for. And there are these moments where there are questions that the law seems to be asking itself about slavery and about patriarchy. Christine Hayes goes into some detail with that in her lecture, and I'll let her fill that part in for you, but I'll point out one example, and this is the daughters of Zelophehad. If you haven't read this story, I would say it's kind of amazing. Numbers chapter 26, and then they come back at the very last chapter of the book of Numbers. There's kind of a resumption of the story of the daughters of Zelophehad. But this is a story, you could turn to Numbers 26 and read it yourself, and I'll try to summarize just a bit here. But these 5 women come forward and say, our father died before we got to inherit any land. And according to the laws, that is the laws that have just been given down at Sinai and so on, according to the laws, we aren't allowed to inherit property. so we're going to die penniless. Somebody else is going to inherit our father's property, and we don't get any share of it. That also means we won't be able to get married and so on, because we won't have any bride price, which is a practice of the ancient world and ancient Israel too. That is, women were understood to come with a dowry, like a payment in a way, to the family to whom they were being married. And so these women say, we're being killed because the law doesn't provide for us. And Moses says, this is a great point. He applauds them for bringing this up, and he goes and prays about it, talks to God about this, talks to the community about this, and after some haggling, there's a new law that's made. And that is, they just got the law in Sinai. They left Sinai, they're on their way to the Promised Land, and already they find some problems in the law. And one of those problems is that women aren't treated as equals under the law, and that creates some problems for communal well-being. And Moses tries to find a way, and God tries to find a way to create new law that's going to provide better for the common well-being. From this example and from other examples, I can say that I think that the main point of the law is that communal well-being, the flourishing of life, if you look at the book of Genesis chapter 12, the well-being, the blessing of the community and of indeed all the nations of the earth is in sight. This is a main part of the law. God wants well-being. And where the law doesn't lead to well-being, then the suggestion is, at least in the narrative of the law itself, in the Torah itself, is that you should change it. It's quite an interesting point, I think. Another really striking image from the law, and I think it has to go along with this idea of the communal well-being, of just basic neighborliness, is this concern for the vulnerable, which you don't find in ancient law codes. Ancient Eastern law codes presume a hierarchy. They presume that if you read Hammurabi's code, there's parts about free people, there's parts about slave people, there's parts about people that are basically peasants who don't get very good protections under the law. Ancient Israel seems to have kind of one category of people, and that's people. Of course, there are issues having to do with slavery, but and of course the status of women is a huge issue in ancient Israel, or at least should be, for our study of it. But in general, when there are laws given in ancient Israel, there is no mention of like an aristocracy getting better laws. The king doesn't get treated differently in the law codes of ancient Israel. In ancient Babylon, let's say, there were different laws for rich folk, for powerful folk, for folk in the right families. There are also no laws in Hammurabi's code. Hammurabi in the prologue mentions that he likes to take care of orphans and widows, but it's all charity. That is, the law itself doesn't provide for people who are weak, who are poor, who are suffering, who are vulnerable. The law doesn't even mention aliens, wandering people. There's nothing they have a right or a claim to. But in the law code of ancient Israel, we're told again and again, God loves the wanderer, the alien. And God says again and again, because you were a wanderer, you should know the heart of a wanderer. This is in Leviticus 19, this is in Exodus 20. You were an alien, you should understand, you should help aliens. Aliens aren't mentioned in any other ancient law code, and other ancient law codes don't have clauses like that, that try to encourage you to do something, teach you how to do it, give you reasons or motivations for doing these things. It's completely unusual in the ancient world. So ancient Israel has this concern for the vulnerable that seems to be a major part of its conception of its law codes. So I want to point that out and lift that up as I think a huge lesson for us about what God's heart and why God wants to create some of these rules to structure society, but also that God continues to ask us where laws don't cover the vulnerable people in our society, where laws don't help us promote the culture, the well-being of our entire civilization, our entire culture, our entire group, the entire community, then we need to address that. I'll very briefly discuss priests and priestly things. This right here, these famous scrolls, this is the oldest biblical text ever found. Archaeologists date this to about the 8th century BC or 7th century BC. It was found in Jerusalem, not too far from the Temple District. It probably would have been an amulet worn by a priest, and it has the priestly prayer for number 6 on it. It's kind of amazing. I'm still in shock every time I show this exists. But that priestly prayer that's found in number 6 is indeed ancient. It comes from the Iron Age itself. It's about Yahweh showing the divine face and showing us blessing. So anyway, about these priests. These priests were concerned mainly with holiness. Holiness was a problem. If God is holy, set apart, good, fundamentally good, and if we ourselves as people are not good, then we have a big problem. How does a holy God live in the midst of a people who are unholy? I like to liken this to like a nuclear reactor, that God is powerful beyond measure, and that God's power is good, goodness itself. And if we aren't fully good, how are we going to stand by, stand near, get in the way of holiness? So there's lectures that Christine Hayes has on this. Also, Coogan mentions this, discusses this issue of priestliness and holiness and so on. But just to say that the priestly materials that we find in, say, the book of Leviticus are mainly interested in this question, almost in the way that an operator of a nuclear reactor would be interested in questions of safety and protocol. How do we approach God? All right, I'll have more to say about that later, but I hope this has been in some way helpful, and feel free to ask questions in the comments. I look forward to hearing your voices. Thank you.